Hi, everybody. In Chapter 3, we're going to begin the transition to focusing on reasoning, the center of this critical thinking course. Chapters 1 and 2 focused on paraphrasing and reading, but they were laying the foundation for what we're going to start doing now. Remember that the goal of paraphrasing is to capture and convey an author's meaning, whatever that meaning might happen to be. But starting in chapter 3, we're going to begin to focus just on reasoning and focus just on the passages and parts of passages that present reasoning. In this video, I'll introduce the basic techniques for diagramming or schematizing arguments. This is going to be our main way of presenting reasoning. Then we'll look at techniques for schematizing arguments based on structured paraphrases, so drawing connections between Chapter 2 and Chapter 3. And finally, we'll look at basic techniques for schematizing arguments directly from written passages. I'm only going to go over the basics in this video, so make sure that you're reading through the chapter, doing the exercises, and taking advantage of all of the resources that are available to you. Now, reasoning, you'll recall, involves presenting one point or piece of information as a reason to think that another point or piece of information is true or false. Another way of talking about this is inference, and we looked at that in the last chapter using the S and the RI codes. Recall that we use these codes, this relationship, to connect claims or pieces of information. Inference involves pointing out support and conclusion relations, including this idea of support for some claim and also the implications of some claim. Inference is involved when we try to answer questions like, why should I think that this is true, or what should I conclude from this? So we're going to be focusing on reasoning, and the most straightforward way of presenting reasoning, communicating reasoning, is through arguments. Now, what is an argument? Basically, an argument is presented anytime someone gives reasons to believe that some claim is true or false. We can think of arguments then in terms of this three-part definition. So an argument is a set of sentences that consists of premises and a conclusion, where the premises support the conclusion or where the premises are reasons to think that the conclusion is true. So it's very important. An argument is a set of sentences. Simply stating an opinion is not the same as presenting an argument. When you present an opinion and reasons to believe that that opinion is true, then you are presenting an argument. So it's not enough to have a conclusion or opinion, you also have to have premises or pieces of information that support that conclusion. And there's got to be that relationship between the premises and the conclusion, that support relationship, or the premises provide reasons to think that the conclusion is true. So if I were to say, I think that the door is open, and someone were to ask me, why do you think that? And I were to say, well, my reason is that I feel a draft, I've just presented a very simple argument. And we'll present arguments, or schematize, or diagram arguments in the way illustrated at the bottom of the screen. We'll list the premises or pieces of support, use a line to separate the support from the conclusion, and then write out the conclusion underneath that line. Here are a few other examples to illustrate the basic pattern and how we'll schematize or diagram arguments. So the siding lock is missing is a reason to believe that someone tampered with the railroad switch. A black bear was found nearby is a reason to think that the black bear killed the hiker. Now, each one of these examples involves one piece of support and one conclusion, but of course you can have multiple pieces of support for a conclusion as illustrated here. It'll be helpful to label the pieces of support S and use numbers to distinguish the pieces of support, and then label the conclusion C. Now, I pointed out that we've already been looking at these reasoning or inferential relationships in Chapter 2. And the reading for reasoning section from Chapter 3 focuses on helping us to see the connections between the tools that we were using in Chapter 2 and this new schematizing technique that we're using in Chapter 3. So let's illustrate that with a couple of examples. Take a look at this passage here. Go ahead and pause the video, read through the passage, and try to write out a structured paraphrase. Keep in mind that structured paraphrases and schematized arguments are different. Pause the video and write out a structured paraphrase of this passage. Alright, and here's what the structured paraphrase would look like. Notice that there are paired roles operating in this passage. The main point is that eating fish reduces risk of sudden cardiac death, and there are two pieces of support for that main point. Two studies that were conducted, the results of those studies support the main point, and also rely on these etiological connections as well. So notice again that our structured paraphrase technique allows us to highlight several different features about a passage and how the ideas in that passage are related. But as we move into chapter 3, we're just going to focus on reasoning, and schematizing arguments will help us to do that. Now, as we look at this structured paraphrase, in order to identify the support and the conclusion, we already know we can set aside the etiological codes. That leaves us with these S codes, and we know that when a secondary point is labeled S, that means the secondary point is providing support for the point above it. Since both of these secondary points are labeled S, they are both providing support for the main point. So the secondary points are support, and the main point is the conclusion. When we put together our schematized argument, we're going to present that same information, those same relationships, just in a different format. The support is going to go on top, then a line, and the conclusion on the bottom. Now when it comes to the RI codes, we'll use these examples to illustrate. In each case here, again, paired roles are involved, but we're going to not pay attention to the etiological codes. We have a main point and a secondary point in each case. The secondary point is labeled RI. When a secondary point is labeled RI, that means the secondary point is being inferred from the main point, or is implied by the main point, which is to say that the secondary point in these cases are the conclusion, and the main point is providing support for that. So when we set up our schematized arguments, they're going to look like this. Now we can take those basic patterns and apply them to more complicated passages. Here's an article that we were introduced to in Chapter 2 about Flight 2574 and the de-icer that was found 3/4 of a mile from its crash site. Here's the structured paraphrase of that passage along with all of the different codes. This structured paraphrase is more complicated than the ones we just finished looking at. It incorporates both S and RI codes, but using the basic patterns that we've recognized, we can schematize the reasoning based on this paraphrase. We'll begin by eliminating the etiological codes. We're not going to focus on them. And I've numbered the main points and secondary points just so that we can refer to them easily. Now, when it comes to schematizing an argument, we want to identify the support and the conclusions. Well, we know from earlier that when a secondary point is labeled RI, that line is itself a conclusion. It is something that is inferred from or implied by some other piece of support. So in this structured paraphrase, there are two lines that are labeled RI, which is to say that there are two conclusions in this paraphrase. Now we'll have to talk about how that works, but let's just start with these conclusions and see what develops. Let's begin with line 2 in this paraphrase, the conclusion, "It fell off before the crash." Now since line 2 is labeled RI, we know that it is supported by the information above it, by the main point. So we can list that as one of the pieces for support. If we then look through the rest of this paraphrase, we'll notice that line 3 is labeled S. That means that line 3 is a piece of support for the line that it's indented under. In this case, line 3 is indented under line 2, and that means line 3 also provides support for line 2. Now that covers that part of this structured paraphrase, this passage. Let's look at the other conclusion, line 4. Line 4 is labeled RI, and that means it is supported by the line above it, the line it is indented under, which would be, in this case, line 2. And so that part of the structured paraphrase That part of the schematized argument will look like this. Now, if we look at these two arguments and set them on the screen alongside each other, we can ask ourselves whether there's a connection between them or not. Of course, it's possible that in a passage, an author will present two arguments that are independent of each other. That can happen. But in this case, there actually is a relationship between these two arguments. The conclusion of one argument is actually support for the other. The first argument we looked at had line 2 as its conclusion, and that same line 2 is support for a further conclusion, line 4. And so we'll schematize that in this way, using the arrow to indicate that the conclusion of one argument is being used as support in the other argument. What we have here then is an example of a more complex argument, where one argument functions as a sub-argument, or what our text calls a tributary, contributing support to the main argument. Complex arguments and tributaries are discussed starting on page 106, so make sure to take a look at those. At this point, we've captured all of the reasoning that was presented in that structured paraphrase, but we're actually not done yet. When we write a structured paraphrase, our goal is to capture the main point that the author is interested in, and that means we leave out a lot of information, especially background information. But now our focus is shifting to reasoning, and it's going to be the case that some information that is background will be relevant to the reasoning. That means that information that we did not include in the structured paraphrase, we are going to include in our schematized argument. So it would be a good idea to go back and look at the original passage and see whether there's information that, while it's background information, is relevant to the reasoning. Information that helps to strengthen the argument that's being made. There's one such piece of information in this passage toward the bottom. The sudden loss of the de-icer would stall the tail and cause the plane to nosedive. That's background information. That's why it was left out of the structured paraphrase, but it's relevant to the reasoning, so we will want to include it in our schematized argument. And this is what the final schematized argument for this article would look like. So that basically covers the connections between material from Chapter 2 and Chapter 3, connections between structured paraphrases and schematized arguments. But as we move forward, we're going to leave structured paraphrases behind. As we move on and look at new passages, we're not going to write structured paraphrases first and then write schematized arguments. Rather, we're just going to be focusing on identifying reasoning and diagramming arguments. So now we want to look at tools and techniques for schematizing arguments directly from a passage. We want to look at more specific techniques for identifying support and conclusions within a passage that we're reading. So this section of the text is divided into two parts. The first part looks at clues in written text that let you know that reasoning is going on. That's the first step in the process. You need to identify whether reasoning is happening. And only after you've done that can you then go on to look for what is the conclusion and what is the support. And that's what the second part will help us with. Clues that help you to understand the structure of a passage, to identify those different parts. Now, as we go through this, and as you read through the text, you'll notice that the same tools, clues, and flags that are mentioned in the first section are also mentioned in the second section. And that can be a bit confusing at first, but the idea is the first time we point these things out, we're looking at identifying when reasoning is going on, and then we're going to look back at those same clue words and flags to see what they tell us about the structure of the reasoning. So let's start with the first section, clues that let you know that reasoning is going on. Now here we should acknowledge that in a lot of cases, it just is obvious to us when reasoning is being presented. We usually have a good enough grasp of context and what's going on so that we don't have a problem identifying when reasoning is happening. But when the topic that's being discussed is very complicated or just unfamiliar, our normal skills at identifying reasoning may actually mislead us. And that's where it's helpful to have these general indicators. So you'll notice these general indicators are neutral about subject matter. So often when we read texts, we want to focus on the topic. But to help us identify when reasoning is going on, it will help to look past the topic at some of these other indicators. So the first kind of indicators are what our text calls general indicators. Anytime you have a passage where an investigation is going on or a controversy is being discussed, there may well be reasoning presented there. Not always, but often. So if, as you read a passage, you find words like evidence, clue, investigators, etc., regardless of what the specific topic is, those indicator words let you know that reasoning might be happening. The second group of clue words or flags are indirectness flags. When something is known indirectly, there is probably reasoning going on and support nearby. Again, what is known indirectly might be about any number of different topics, but look past the topic to see if there are words like must, may, probably, and so forth. It must be raining outside. This seems like the right thing to do. Those clue words often point to the presence of reasoning. When it comes to this idea of knowing something indirectly, that might be puzzling at first. But to help us wrap our heads around this, just remember that we can know things directly. Usually that's through direct experience or indirectly through reasoning. So take a simple example like there being traffic on the freeway. There are different ways I could know that fact. I could know it directly through actually being in the traffic and experiencing it. Or I could know that indirectly through some other way. And usually that will involve some kind of evidence. One piece of information is being presented as a reason to believe that something is true. The next group of flag words or indicators are what our text calls S and RI flags. So words like because or so, also words like since, for, and therefore. When these words appear, regardless of the topic or subject matter, there's probably reasoning going on. Now, especially when it comes to these S and RI flags, it's worth noting that words like because and so sometimes are used to flag inference, but they can also be used to flag explanation or etiology. So these terms do not always indicate that there's reasoning going on, so be careful of that. One of the especially strong clues that reasoning is going on is when you find more than one type of flag showing up in a text. So in these examples, the door must have been unlocked since there was no sign of forced entry. Must is an indirectness flag, since is an S flag. The fact that both of these flags are being used means it's very likely that reasoning is being presented here. In this next example, the kitchen ceiling has started to drip, so the storm's probably picking up. So is an RI flag, probably is an indirectness flag. The fact that two flags from different categories are being used makes it highly likely that reasoning is being presented. All right, once we've recognized that reasoning is going on, we want to go on to identify what is the conclusion and what is the support. Again, in a lot of contexts, that may just be obvious to us. But if the topic of an article is unfamiliar or complicated, it will be helpful to pay attention to these flag terms. They're not always going to be present, but when they are present, they provide very helpful clues as to what is going on in a passage. The first type of clue word is what our text calls a link flag, and these are the most helpful indicators. Words like so, therefore, hence, it follows that. These are especially helpful because they always arrange the support and conclusion in a particular way. If you come across the word therefore in a text, the information preceding the therefore is going to be support, and the information following is going to be a conclusion. For instance, the oncoming cars are all using their windshield wipers, therefore we must be driving into the rain. The first part of that sentence is support, the second part is conclusion. Here's another example. All past attempts to rehabilitate this company have failed, so we should just shut it down. Again, the first part is support, the second part is conclusion. It's just the case that you won't find the conclusion and support arranged differently when these link flags are present. So these are most helpful for identifying the support and conclusion within a passage. The second type of clue word or flags are conclusion flags. words like must, may, probably. These words tend to attach themselves to the conclusion. So people were confused during the drill, preparation must have been inadequate. Must attaches itself to the conclusion. Now, these words are not as helpful as the link flags because the conclusion and support may appear in different orders. But the thing to watch for is that the must or may or probably will tend to attach to the conclusion. Another type of flag that's closely related to the conclusion flags are mental flags, words like believe or suspect. So if someone says, I believe that she's home since her lights are on and her car is in the driveway, I believe that indicates that she is home is the conclusion that's being drawn. Again, mental flags will attach to the conclusion. The conclusion and support may be presented in a different order, though. The third type of flags are support flags, words like because, since, or after all. These words, they're called support flags because they tend to attach to support. Again, the order of the support and conclusion may be different, but the support flag will tend to attach to the support. Finally, we want to highlight one other set of markers to look for that can help us to identify conclusions in a text. These are not like the first three types of flags. These are not structure flags in the same way, but they often help us to identify the conclusions of passages. So if someone is presenting a proposal or recommendation, or presenting a prediction, and there's reasoning going on, those proposals, those predictions will usually function as conclusions. So in these examples, since the temperature was so high, we should cancel the event. Notice that we should cancel the event is a recommendation, and that's further evidence that reasoning is going on here. The fact that a recommendation is being presented here also indicates that the word since is not doing its etiological or explanatory job, because you can't provide etiologies for recommendations or for predictions. When recommendations and predictions show up then, they will usually function as conclusions of reasoning. I want to highlight one more point about technique before moving to a couple examples, and that's this. Remember that structure flags should be removed from schematized arguments. This is discussed in your textbook on pages 116 and 117. Read that section carefully and keep that in mind. It's an important part of communicating clearly, and it's going to be important for your grade on the quizzes. Structure flags should be removed from schematized arguments. So here are a few examples of what this looks like. Here's a sentence, the oncoming cars are all using their windshield wipers, so we must be driving into the rain. When we schematize that argument, it'll look like this. And here we notice that the word so does not appear, and the word must also does not appear. The reason is that the words so and must basically function to let us know that reasoning is going on. But when we set up our schematized argument, it's the arrangement of the lines, the different symbols that are used that lets us know about the reasoning and its structure. So the clue words are going to be eliminated. Here's another example. The kitchen ceiling has started to drip, so the storm's probably picking up. When we schematize that, we drop the word so and we drop the word probably. The conclusion is just that the storm's picking up. This is also going to be true of mental flags. I believe that she's home since her lights are on and her car is in the driveway. Notice that the conclusion is she is home. The conclusion is not I believe that she's home. Now we can imagine cases where someone might be trying to convince you that I believe that she's home. If the phrase I believe that is part of the conclusion, then it should be included in the schematized argument. If it is not part of the conclusion, then it should not appear in the schematized argument. Here's another example to highlight the contrast now. We should leave now because traffic will get bad shortly. Notice the conclusion in our schematized argument is we should leave now. The reason is that should is not a structure flag. Should lets us know that the conclusion is a recommendation. So the rule that structure flags should be removed from schematized arguments only applies to structure flags. Don't just be dropping information from the passage left and right. That'll lead to greater confusion. Again, another example, all past attempts to rehabilitate this company have failed, so we should just shut it down. Again, the word so is a structure flag. It is eliminated. Should is not a structure flag. It should not be eliminated. Now, here are some more interesting examples. Millions of people are dying of starvation. We must do something about that. Now, in this case, notice I have included the word must in the conclusion. That is because in this case, the word must is not functioning as a structure flag. Here, the word must is a synonym for should. We should do something about that. So the word is retained. Again, you'll want to remember that words can have multiple meanings. So sometimes the word must is used as a structure flag, sometimes it's not. And in those cases where it's being used as a structure flag, it should be eliminated, but not otherwise. Here's another example. President Obama said he may sign the new economic legislation today, so Republicans are probably feeling anxious. And when I schematize this argument, I eliminate the words so and probably because they are functioning as structure flags, but I leave the word may in the support. That's because President Obama did not say that he would sign the new economic legislation. He said that he might sign it. And so if we were to eliminate that word, we would actually be distorting what President Obama said. One more example. The owners of this casino are crooks, so you may get cheated. When we schematize this, we eliminate the so, but we leave the may in there. May is not functioning as a structure flag. The person who's making this statement is not saying that you will get cheated. They're just saying that there's a possibility that you'll get cheated. And so that term needs to stay in there. Look at these different examples and the other examples from the exercises to work on drawing the distinction between when these cases are used as structure flags and when they're not. All right, we'll wrap up this video by looking at a couple exercises. This first example comes from an article entitled "Dogs May Have Eaten Dead Woman's Body." This article is actually also printed on page 119 of your textbook, so it might be helpful to look at the text there. Now, if our task is to write out a schematized argument for this passage, how might we go about doing that? Again, if we feel really comfortable with the topic, we might not feel the need to pay attention to clue words and structure flags, but it'll be helpful to practice those techniques so that you can apply them in other more challenging cases. As we read through this passage, we can identify a number of structure flags. The word may, apparently, think, and believes. These are all words that let us know that reasoning is going on in this passage, and they also are helpful for identifying the parts of the reasoning, the support and the conclusion. In this case, all of these highlighted words are conclusion flags of one kind or another, either indirectness flags or mental flags. So we're told dogs may have eaten dead woman's body. We're told that her body was apparently eaten by her pet dogs. We think the dogs completely chewed up her body. We believe her body was eaten by her dogs. So, several places in this passage, the conclusion is expressed. What is that conclusion? Mrs. Hesse's dogs ate most of her body. Now, as we look through the rest of this passage, there are no support flags, but having identified the conclusion, we can look through the rest of the article and the rest of the information will basically provide the support. We're told that only her skull and one foot could be located on her property. The investigators dug around. Perhaps they thought that the dogs might have buried her body, but after searching and not locating her body, they come to believe that her dogs ate most of her body. If we look at the second half of the article, we're given another piece of support, and that is that her pet dogs seemed well fed, in spite of the fact that 3 to 4 weeks separated her death from the discovery of her body. Notice that I'm summing up the information that's presented here, and those techniques for paraphrasing, for summarizing, are still important for the work that we're doing. So keep that in mind. And this is a complete schematized argument for this passage. One more example that we'll look at, this short article. It will probably rain here within 24 hours. Read through this passage and try to identify the different structure flags. Because if you look at the map, you can see that the radar is showing rain across the entire valley and temperatures are dropping sharply on a line to the south. That means we've got a storm system just south of Elko, so unless something unusual happens, the storm will be here sometime tomorrow. Alright, as we look through this passage, we can identify 4 different structure flags. Probably, because, that means, and so. Now, we can go about schematizing this argument in different ways. I'm going to start by identifying what parts of this passage are conclusions. So notice the first sentence, it will probably rain here within 24 hours. Probably is an indirectness flag, and that indicates that that is a conclusion. Notice when I write out the conclusion, I eliminate the structure flag. The conclusion is it will rain here tomorrow. Another structure flag that points to a conclusion is the expression, and that means. So some support has been presented, and that means, conclusion, we've got a storm system just south of Elko. Now the conclusion that's presented in the first line is actually restated at the very end of the article. The storm will be here sometime tomorrow. Notice that's not a third conclusion, that's a restatement of the first conclusion. Once we've identified our conclusions, then we can go on to look for the support. Let's start by looking at the conclusion, there is a storm system south of Elko. The expression, and that means, indicates that the information that comes before is going to be support. So if we look in that previous sentence, we're told because. If you look at the map, you can see that the radar is showing rain across the entire valley, and the temperatures are dropping sharply on a line to the south. Those are the 2 pieces of support for that conclusion. We're told S1, S2, and that means C. Now, when you first read through this article, it will probably rain here within 24 hours because, if you look, you might have thought that the information in the second sentence would support the first sentence. But taking the whole article together, this is a better way of mapping things out. Again, we're told, and that means we've got a storm system south of Elko, so unless something unusual happens, the storm will be here sometime tomorrow. The word so lets us know that the fact that there's a storm system south of Elko provides support for the conclusion that it will rain here tomorrow. We've got a storm system just south of Elko, so ... the storm will be here sometime tomorrow. At this point, we've covered everything in this article except for that one expression, unless something unusual happens. Now that's an important piece of information, but in order to incorporate it into our schematized argument, we need to rephrase it. And here's how we would do that. So what is that unless something unusual happens clause expressing? Basically this idea that storms south of Elko usually get here the next day. If nothing unusual happens, the storm will be here tomorrow. So what is it that usually happens? Storms south of Elko usually get here the next day. At this point, we have 2 small arguments. Are they completely independent of each other? Actually, they are connected to one another. The conclusion of one bit of reasoning is support for another bit of reasoning. And so the argument for the conclusion that there is a storm system south of Elko is a tributary, part of the main argument, the conclusion of which is it will rain here tomorrow. Hopefully these examples help you to get an idea of how to schematize arguments. Again, make sure that you're practicing these techniques. When you're dealing with simple passages or topics that are familiar to you, you may not feel the need to use these different tools in order to unpack the reasoning. However, you should practice these skills with the simple exercises because then you'll be able to use them in the more complicated exercises. So make sure that you're practicing the online exercises, the exercises in your book, and if you have questions, remember to send questions to the instructor. All right, good luck with your work.